A man walked into Harlem thinking his skin made him untouchable. He spoke words no father should ever hear about his wife and daughter. Bumpy Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Harlem, 1964, the kind of day where the heat sat heavy on the pavement and people moved slow, conserving energy for the evening. Lenox Avenue was alive, street vendors calling out prices, children weaving between stoops, women carrying bags of groceries home, normal, ordinary, until it wasn't. Mayme Johnson walked with her daughter past the corner of 135th Street. She wasn't flashy, never had been. She carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind that comes from being married to a man whose name alone could shift the temperature of a room. Her daughter, young and unaware of the weight her last name carried, walked beside her, laughing at something small. Then a man stepped into their path. He was white, tall, well-dressed in a way that suggested money, or at least the appearance of it. His eyes moved over Mayme and her daughter in a way that stripped them bare, reduced them to something less than human. And then he spoke. The words don't need repeating. They were vile, racial, sexual, the kind of insult designed to humiliate, to degrade, to remind a black woman that in his world she was nothing. Mayme didn't flinch. She'd lived through worse. But her daughter looked up at her mother, confused, hurt, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't come. The street went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Vendors froze. A man selling newspapers lowered his stack and stared. Everyone knew who Mayme was. And more importantly, everyone knew who her husband was. The white man didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and he simply didn't care. He smirked, turned, and walked away, disappearing into the flow of the avenue like nothing had happened. But something had. A boy no older than 12 sprinted down the block, ducking into a storefront 2 streets over. Inside, sitting at a table with 3 older men, Bumpy Johnson was mid-conversation. The boy didn't wait for permission. "Mr. Johnson," he said, breathless. "Your wife." Bumpy didn't let him finish. He stood, slowly. His face didn't change. He didn't ask questions. He already knew. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man who needed to explain himself. He didn't make speeches. He didn't write manifestos or preach from corners. His code was simple, and everyone in Harlem understood it without a single word being spoken. Respect the community. Protect the vulnerable. Never let an insult to family go unanswered. He had built his reputation not on random violence, but on calculated justice. When the Italian mob tried to flood Harlem with heroin in the 50s, Bumpy didn't go to war. He made them need him. When dirty cops shook down local businesses, Bumpy didn't fight them in the streets. He owned the precincts from the inside. Power, real power, wasn't loud. It was inevitable. But there were lines even Bumpy's enemies knew not to cross, and family was the brightest one. Mayme wasn't just his wife. She was his anchor. In a world where Bumpy moved through shadows, lies, and shifting allegiances, she was the one constant. She had stood by him through prison sentences, through wars with the Genovese family, through the endless parade of threats that came with his name. She never asked him to be softer. She never demanded he leave the life. She simply loved him, and in return he made sure no harm ever came to her door. Their daughter was the future, the hope that maybe, just maybe, the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles. Bumpy had killed men. He had ordered deaths. He had broken bones and burned bridges. But his daughter? She was supposed to be untouchable. She was supposed to walk through Harlem without fear, without insult, without some fool reminding her that the world still saw her as less than human. And now a man, a white man, no less, had shattered that illusion in broad daylight. Bumpy left the storefront without a word. The men at the table didn't ask where he was going. They knew. One of them, a lieutenant named James, stood to follow, but Bumpy raised a hand. Not yet. He walked up Lenox Avenue alone, his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of calm. People saw him coming and stepped aside, not out of fear, out of respect. They nodded, some whispered. Word was already spreading. By the time Bumpy reached his building, half of Harlem knew. A white man had insulted Mayme and her daughter, and Bumpy Johnson was moving. The only question left was how he would respond. And in Harlem in 1964, under Bumpy's rule, that question had only one answer. Controlled, deliberate, unforgettable. His name was Robert Halloway, 42 years old, a real estate developer from Connecticut who had recently started buying properties in Harlem. He saw opportunity where others saw struggle. He saw dollar signs where families lived. He saw himself as a pioneer, a businessman ahead of his time, bringing progress to a neighborhood that didn't ask for it. He wasn't connected to the mob. He had no ties to organized crime. He was just a man with money, arrogance, and a dangerous assumption that his whiteness would protect him. Halloway had been in Harlem for 3 weeks, long enough to close 2 deals on apartment buildings, long enough to evict 4 families, long enough to believe he understood the rhythm of the streets, but he didn't. He had mistaken politeness for weakness. He had mistaken silence for submission. When he insulted Mayme and her daughter, he thought nothing of it. To him, they were just 2 black women on a street corner, nameless, powerless. He had said worse to tenants he was forcing out. He had said worse to his own maids back home. It was reflex, habit, the casual cruelty of a man who had never been held accountable. He didn't know Mayme's last name. He didn't know who her husband was. And by the time he found out, it was already too late. Bumpy didn't move in haste. He never did. Haste was for amateurs. Haste led to mistakes, arrests, unnecessary bloodshed. Bumpy had survived decades in a world that killed men for far less because he understood something most didn't. Patience was a weapon. He made a phone call, then another. Within an hour he knew everything about Robert Halloway, where he lived, where he worked, what bar he drank at after closing deals, what hotel he stayed in when he came to Harlem, who he did business with, who he owed money to. Bumpy sat in his apartment that evening across from Mayme. She didn't ask him what he was going to do. She didn't need to. She had been with him long enough to know. Their daughter was in the other room, unaware that her father was already several moves ahead, already constructing the response that would echo through the city. "He didn't know," Mayme said quietly. "That's not an excuse," Bumpy replied. His voice was calm, even. "Ignorance doesn't grant immunity." She nodded. She didn't argue. She had seen this before, the stillness before Bumpy acted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't emotion. It was something colder, something more precise. He stood, buttoned his jacket and walked to the door. James was waiting outside, along with 2 others. They didn't speak. Bumpy gave a single nod, and they followed him into the night. Robert Halloway had made a mistake, a fatal one, in the only way that mattered in Harlem. Not fatal to his life, but fatal to everything he thought he understood about power. And tomorrow, in broad daylight, he would learn the difference. Robert Halloway returned to Harlem the next morning at 10:30. He parked his Lincoln Continental on 125th Street, 2 blocks from the building he was scheduled to inspect. He wore a grey suit, polished shoes, and the same smug confidence he always carried. He had already forgotten yesterday's encounter. To him, it was nothing. A moment. Disposable. But Harlem hadn't forgotten. Bumpy had spent the night making calls, positioning pieces on a board Halloway didn't even know existed. He didn't want this done in an alley. He didn't want it done behind closed doors where only a few would witness. No, this needed to be public. This needed to be a lesson, not just for Halloway, but for every man who thought he could walk into Harlem and disrespect its people without consequence. Halloway stepped out of his car and locked the door. The street was busy, mid-morning foot traffic, vendors setting up, people heading to work. Normal. He started walking toward his appointment, briefcase in hand. Then the crowd began to shift. At first it was subtle. A few men stepped into his path, not blocking him. Just present. Then a few more. Within seconds, Halloway found himself surrounded by a semicircle of faces, not threatening, not aggressive, just watching. He stopped, looked around. His confidence flickered. "Excuse me," he said, trying to step through. No one moved. That's when Bumpy appeared. He came from the left, walking slow, hands in his pockets. He wasn't dressed for a show, just a simple suit, clean and understated. But the moment he entered the circle, the air changed. People stopped talking. Vendors lowered their voices. Even the traffic seemed to quiet. Bumpy stopped 5 feet from Halloway. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at him, studied him, let the silence press down like a weight. Halloway's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words caught. You know who I am? Bumpy asked. His voice was calm, conversational almost. Holloway shook his head. I don't. You should. Bumpy took one step closer. Yesterday you said some words, on Lenox Avenue, to a woman and her daughter. Holloway's face went pale. Recognition hit him like cold water. His eyes darted to the crowd, looking for an exit, for help, for anything. But no one moved. No one was coming. I didn't, he stammered. I didn't know. No, Bumpy interrupted, his tone still even, still controlled. You didn't. But ignorance doesn't erase the insult. It doesn't undo what you said, and it sure as hell doesn't protect you now. Holloway's hands trembled. I'm sorry. I swear. I didn't mean. You meant every word. Bumpy's eyes didn't blink. You meant it because you thought you could. You thought your skin, your money, your car. He gestured toward the Lincoln, gave you permission. You thought Harlem was a place you could walk through without respect. The crowd tightened slightly. Not menacing, just present. Witnesses. Please, Holloway whispered. I'll leave. I'll never come back. I swear. Bumpy tilted his head slightly as if considering. Then he spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. You're right. You won't come back. But before you go, you're going to understand something. In Harlem, a man protects his family. A man protects his people. And when someone violates that, there's a price. He nodded once. 2 men stepped forward, not to beat him, not to kill him. They took his briefcase, opened it, pulled out contracts, deeds, business papers, and one by one they tore them in half, slowly, deliberately. The sound of ripping paper echoed in the silence. Holloway watched, helpless, as his deals dissolved in front of him. Then they took his wallet, removed every dollar, handed the cash to an older woman standing nearby. She took it without a word, nodded at Bumpy, and walked away. Bumpy leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper only Holloway could hear. You leave Harlem. You don't come back. You don't do business here. You don't even think about this place. Because if I hear your name again, if I see your face again, what happens next won't be this gentle. Do you understand me? Holloway nodded, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. Bumpy stepped back. The crowd parted. A clear path opened toward Holloway's car. He ran. Robert Holloway left Harlem that day and never returned. He didn't file a police report. He didn't tell his business partners what happened. He simply disappeared from the neighborhood like smoke, his Lincoln speeding across the bridge back to Connecticut, his hand still shaking on the wheel. He sold his Harlem properties within the month, took a loss, didn't negotiate. He wanted nothing to do with that place, that street, that name. Years later, when colleagues would ask why he abandoned such a profitable venture, he'd change the subject. Some humiliations you don't speak about. Some lessons you carry in silence. But Harlem spoke about it. The story spread fast. By nightfall, every bar, every barbershop, every corner had heard some version of what happened on 125th Street. The details varied. Some said Bumpy had 20 men with him. Others said he stood alone. Some claimed Holloway was beaten. Others said he wasn't touched. But the truth, the part that mattered, stayed consistent. A white man insulted Bumpy Johnson's family, and Bumpy made him pay without spilling a drop of blood. That was the part people remembered. Not rage, not violence, control. The police heard about it too. A sergeant from the 28th Precinct came by Bumpy's building 2 days later asking questions. Bumpy sat across from him in a local diner sipping coffee, calm as Sunday morning. We heard there was an incident, the sergeant said carefully. What kind of incident? Bumpy replied. Intimidation. Threats. A man named Holloway says he was robbed. Bumpy raised an eyebrow. Robbed? In broad daylight? On a busy street? Strange no one reported it. The sergeant stared at him. Bumpy stared back, unbothered. If he felt unsafe, Bumpy continued, maybe Harlem wasn't the right place for him. Maybe he realized that on his own. The sergeant closed his notebook. He knew better than to push. There were no witnesses who would talk, no evidence, no case, just a white businessman who left town in a hurry and a black man who happened to be having coffee 2 blocks away at the time. Stay out of trouble, Bumpy, the sergeant said as he stood. Always do, Bumpy replied. The sergeant walked out. Bumpy finished his coffee, and Harlem understood once again that its protector was still watching, still present, still untouchable. Years passed. Bumpy Johnson's name continued to carry weight long after that day on 125th Street. The story of Robert Halloway became legend, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No guns, no bloodshed, no bodies. Just a man stripped of his arrogance in front of a community that would never forget. It became a teaching moment. Fathers told it to sons. Older men shared it over card games. It wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries. About what happens when you cross a man who understands that true power doesn't announce itself with violence, it announces itself with presence. Bumpy never spoke about it publicly. He didn't need to. The streets did that for him. And in doing so, they reinforced something deeper than fear. They reinforced respect. Other businessmen came to Harlem after Halloway, some with good intentions, some without. But they all heard the stories. They all learned the rules. You could do business in Harlem. You could even profit. But you did so with respect. You didn't insult the people. You didn't disrespect the families. And you certainly didn't disrespect Bumpy Johnson's. Mayme never asked him what he did that day. She didn't need the details. She saw the result. Her daughter walked the streets freely again, head high, unafraid. That was enough. Bumpy's daughter grew up knowing her father was different. She heard the whispers, saw the way people treated him. But she also saw the way he treated her mother, with reverence, with protection, with a love that didn't need to be spoken aloud. That was his real legacy. Not the fear he inspired in enemies, but the safety he provided for those he loved. When Bumpy died in 1968, the story of Halloway was still being told. It had become part of Harlem's fabric, woven into the understanding of what leadership looked like in a world that tried to strip black men of their dignity. Bumpy Johnson had defended his family the same way he defended his neighborhood, with calm, with authority, and with the absolute certainty that some lines, once drawn, are never negotiable. That was power. That was legacy. That was Bumpy.